All right, this is part 3 of our episode on corruption. This is the Unjerked podcast. Let's get started.
Okay, we haven't gotten to this one yet. I hear so many of my friends talk about auditing the Fed and how corrupt they are. What are your thoughts?
I mean, I think we can audit them if we want to, but I don't really think we're going to find anything that scandalous. I'm just trying to understand, like, what exactly is the thing that they think is happening.
I'm not sure either. I think it's something along the line of, the more towards money becoming a made up thing that we get, the more into fiat currency we are, the more people just feel like, what is going on with the Fed?
Well, all money,
I think there's just some mystery there.
Money fundamentally is made up. Like, all money is fake in a certain way. I mean, money is ultimately the level of trust you have in the central power. And the reason we have, the reason dollars are used is because you're required to pay taxes in dollars. And so, because like technically you don't have to use dollars for most transactions. You can use scrip, or you can, trade, like give someone peanut butter in exchange for like mayonnaise or whatever. But in practice, there's various traits that money needs to have. And on top of that, you have to pay taxes in dollars. And so it's just, that leads to people using dollars. But yeah, I mean, sure, audit the Fed. Why not? But I don't really think, like, what exactly is the thing that they think is going to be uncovered? I don't quite understand, like, because the Fed basically buys and sells treasuries. That's not the only thing they do, but that's one lever they use to kind of control the money supply. The other is setting the federal funds rate, and then there's also, they set the reserve requirement for banks, and then they also regulate the banks. But I'm not really sure. A lot of the sort of anti-Fed people, I think for them, the Fed is like, the sort of like, big scary bad guy. Like, oh, they control our money supply, which, I mean, that is what they do. But I think, they're basically just a bunch of econ nerds, really. They're not, I don't think they're anything nefarious. Anyways.
Yeah, I agree with you on that. And I think that's usually what I tell people when they bring it up.
Yeah.
Okay, here's a wild card one. And to remind everyone, we are on Circle Jerk Solutions to political corruption. And this one is Rule by AI, which I have definitely heard on Joe Rogan and by some other people. Basically, what if instead of politicians, we just made a machine rule society so that it can't be corrupted?
Well, I think, anyone who has done software engineering or developed software knows, I mean, software is a very human thing in the sense that it's made by humans, it's written by humans. And so it's basically a way of formalizing rules in specific circumstances. But at the end of the day, it's still created by humans, and it's still affected by, what the humans who made it were looking for. So I don't really think it could be more consistent. But number one, I think there's still going to be various biases in any software that's developed, AI or whatever, especially the training data. If the training data has, in specific to AI, if the training data has biases, which it always does, that'll be reflected in the output. Then number two, like, how do you convince people to abide by the outputs of the AI? You still have to convince people that this makes sense. And I think a lot of people would push back. So I think this is a completely untenable solution.
Yeah, I think it would be untenable in that I don't think anyone would want to be ruled by a computer, even if it's even if supposedly you designed one that is better and more fair and less corrupt than a human. I think people would still want people representing them. But here is an idea that might meet this thought halfway is, and I think this will probably happen soon, is say you're in Congress, you're forming a law. Now all of the aides and people reading and evaluating each law, and also probably journalists start using AI to start detecting corruption in these massive spending bills and things.
That could be a good idea as a way of data mining, essentially. Like how look through it quickly, because you have several hundred page long laws. You could find things that say like, hey, wait a minute, there's this thing included, and and then this person who helped write the law has this interest. So I think that's fair. Next,
I think that would be a pretty good idea. Yeah, this next bullet, I can't believe this has not come up yet, but politicians trading stocks. That's a huge thing people complain about. The whole, I make a ton of money by just watching what Nancy Pelosi does.
Yeah, so I 100% agree. Politicians trading stock is corruption. I agree with that 100%. I think
I do too.
In a lot of industries in the private sector, especially like industries where you have insider knowledge, like you are basically banned from trading stocks, at least in those areas. I know in a lot of finance, you're not, like, if you are have insider knowledge about a company, like you're not allowed to trade stocks at all. And then there's often a window of you're only allowed to buy index funds, and there's a window of time where you're allowed to make trades, like only like 1 week out of the year. And I think it might make sense for Congress to have those same rules, and they have a level of insider knowledge that like nobody else really has, in terms of like understanding the macro environment. So yeah, it makes sense. I think the flip side is they should get paid more to kind of compensate. I think if it was like, hey, you get paid a really high salary, but you can't trade stocks, I think that would be a good trade-off. And then term limits we already talked about, so I think we can kind of,
Yeah. Beat that one to death. All right.
So
that's the end of these circle jerk solutions.
Yeah. So why, different countries have different levels of corruption. When you really think about it, it's actually pretty simple in terms of like what affects that. And essentially, it's an incentive argument. What is the incentive to be corrupt, and what is the disincentive to be corrupt? And if the reward of corruption is larger than the cost of being convicted times the probability of being convicted, then you'll be corrupt, more likely than not. If the reward is less than the cost of conviction times probability of conviction, you'll probably not be corrupt. I think there's a pretty obvious calculus that basically exists.
I don't think anyone's actually doing that equation, but they more or less are, yes.
Yeah, but like, if you know for a fact, like, hey, like if I take this bribe, I'm going to go to prison for like 10 years, you're not going to take the bribe. It's when you say, okay, like I'm not going to actually go to prison. That's when people take bribes. So there's this paper, says a comparative study of inequality and corruption, by Jongsung Yu and Sanjeev Kagram from the American Sociological Review in 2005. And they basically says this article argues that income inequality increases the level of corruption through material and normative mechanisms. So the wealthy have more motivation and more opportunity to be corrupt. And then the poor are more vulnerable to extortion and less able to monitor and hold the rich and powerful accountable as inequality increases. So that was more or less a direct quote from the abstract. But that kind of explains, pretty simple model of like why when society is very unequal, there's more corruption. Wealthy people are more able to get away with it. Poor people are less able to avoid it in terms of having to be the one that pays bribes, for example. So inequality is very bad. I think poverty in general, corruption is more endemic in impoverished environments where there's more, need to secure economic resources. I couldn't find a paper on this, but I from what I've read, it seems like extraction economies often are easier to be, corruption is easier, places where you're basically extracting natural resources. It's easier for like nefarious parties to get a hold of those resources. Whereas I think if you have an economy that's more skills based, it's harder to kind of nefariously capture the value of high skilled workers, for example. I don't know.
What if we had one, we designated one emperor to change a house control over the extraction of natural resources in an extraction economy, and they change the houses every so often.
Is that like a Dune reference?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So I think Dune is incredibly overrated.
Another topic for another time.
Yeah. So here's another paper: Effects of Public Sector Wages on Corruption, Wage Inequality Matters. And I can't pronounce the names of the authors, but this is from the Journal of Comparative Economics. So it says this paper uses a new country-level panel data to study the effect of public sector wages on corruption. It shows that wage inequality in the public sector is an important determinant of the effectiveness of anti-corruption policies. So if you increase the wages of officials, it could help reduce corruption. But if there's a big differential in wages within the public sector, this could increase corruption, interestingly enough. I have mixed feelings about that, because I do think, because a lot of public sector salaries right now are basically set by, like, there's a lot of homogeneity in terms, like, regardless of the type of work you're doing. The scale of salaries is relatively across the board similar. But I do wonder, for certain high-skilled jobs, like if you're a software engineer in the government, should you get paid more? I kind of feel like there's a strong argument to pay someone more in that position. That's a separate topic.
I mean, I think that's really tough, especially for those high-skilled jobs. Like, they get paid so much.
Yeah, but
this
paper's arguing that essentially, assuming public sector wages are relatively similar across the board, if you increase the wages across the board, that typically reduces corruption. And again, this is like cost versus benefit. Like, if you're already getting paid more, you have less of a reason to take bribes. And in fact, I didn't find a paper on this, but I think if you have a big pension on the other end, at the end of your career, that could also be a way to reduce corruption, because the penalty for being caught could be losing your pension. And so I think you can create a system of incentives that really, really reduces this sort of incentive structure of taking bribes. And so, from my understanding, a lot of, basically when you professionalize and really kind of create when having a public sector, it doesn't have to be public sector, but when your job involves, strong benefits, a pension at the end, very kind of defined structure in that sense, that really reduces the incentive to be corrupt and to take bribes. But if your pay is awful, if there's, no benefits at the back end, then it's a lot easier to justify the taking of bribes, saying, oh, well, I have to take care of my family, blah, blah, blah. So I do think higher salaries for the public sector does tend to reduce corruption. I think that also applies to politicians.
Well, that's one thing, but then we're getting into an issue here, because, like, if you advocate for, more term limits, politicians being in place at a shorter amount of time, and then like what did they do afterwards without accepting a high-paying private sector job for some lobbyist or some other company?
Well, I think
how do you rectify that?
I think so. I think one problem right now is a lot of very high-performing people are dissuaded from becoming politicians because the pay is honestly not that high, considering this, the responsibilities you have. You as a member of, if you're in the House of Representatives, you get paid like $185 or something, which might seem like a lot, but if you look at people from elite institutions, elite universities, a lot of them enter jobs where they're making that amount by the time they're like 25 or 26. And so,
yeah,
I think
especially if you're a high performer.
Yeah. So I think if you had higher salaries, you would have people hire more high-skilled people wanting to work in politics. And then I also think for those people, once they leave politics, they already have a career they can go back to, right? So I do think it would still help in terms of reducing corruption because they would still have exit options. It's like, hey, I'll go back to being, it's like, let's say you were running like a real estate investment firm or whatever. It's like, hey, I could go back to that,
But like if you're like a technically minded person or you're going back to some field and for the greater good of the voter, you just screwed over all companies in that field. Like, are you still going to screw over all of those corporations if you think that they won't hire you back for the regulations that you just voted into place?
There might be some of that, but I still think higher salaries overall would incentivize better behavior, I think. And term limits, I still have mixed feelings on term limits. I think it depends, there's pros and cons to it. I think for president, there definitely should be term limits. But for members of Congress, I have mixed feelings about it. And then when it comes to cost and probability of conviction, so level of transparency is an obvious thing. So there's this paper, European Journal of Government and Economics, Transparency in Local Government Corruption, What Does Lack of Transparency Hide? And they look at Spain's 110 largest municipalities, and it says transparency is inversely related to the likelihood of local political corruption. I'm not going to go into the methodology, but basically, it's pretty obvious. Like, if there's a bigger spotlight on what's happening, you're not going to get away with it as easily. So that's why I think good journalism is very important. And mechanisms that basically... Yeah. And I think mechanisms that basically...
Journalism's paramount to this.
Journalism and also, like, requirements saying, like, you have to have city council meetings recorded and available to the public. You need to, have, like, the minutes of the decision-making of this thing published or like, you need to, like, make public, like, who donated to your campaign. I think all of those things reduce corruption. And then there's
now I'm thinking AI is the answer. All that. That's just so much work.
So rule of law. So this paper, does better governance guarantee less corruption? Evidence of loss and effectiveness of the rule of law. Okay, I don't know what journal this is for, but basically it says it's by Guerrero and Castaneda Ramos, but basically it says corruption is an endemic societal problem. Okay, so the big point here, it says our simulations suggest the improvements to the rule of law are necessary yet not sufficient condition to curb corruption. So this paper is saying rule of law is necessary, but that alone will not reduce corruption. So it does still matter. The rule of law, essentially what rule of law is that everybody is upheld to the same standards. In terms of if they break the law, they get punished for it. Obviously, very
okay.
You need
in that abstract, they said the simulations show. How did they simulate this? Civ 5?
I don't know.
Yeah, that's a joke and a real question.
Next,
so look into that.
So next is impunity. So this paper, I need to translate it because it's written in Spanish.
Yeah, that is in Spanish.
So basically, this paper, and this paper is impunity, corruption, and human rights. So essentially, they look at the human rights angle mixed with corruption. And basically, they say when corruption nor a human rights violation is punished, impunity becomes a context that encourages the perpetrator to continue committing corruption, which will generate new human rights violations. This is pretty intuitive. Impunity is essentially getting away with, basically getting away with things. If the probability of being caught is low, if the punishment is small, that's essentially impunity. And if there's impunity, there's going to be more corruption, period.
Well, we already talked about that in our crime episode.
Yeah, but it applies to corruption as well. Yeah. And then there's this paper, so weak institutions. So this paper says, why do corrupt governments maintain public support? by Manzetti, Wilson. And basically, they say, why do citizens support corrupt governments? And it says, when institutions are weak and patron-client relationships are strong, there's more likely to be support for a public leader to receive benefits. So essentially, if you have a system of patronage where you need loyalty networks to get resources from the state, that promotes corruption. But if you have strong institutions that basically use a more fair system of handing out benefits based off of actual need, there's less corruption. So that's a big thing as well. So if you want to reduce corruption, you need to essentially have higher pay, stronger economy, better rule of law, more transparency, stronger institutions, etc. All very sort of kind of obvious when you think about it, really. And then civic culture. So there's this paper, Corruption and Trust, Theoretical Considerations and Evidence from Mexico by Morris and Klessner. And basically they say, they're basically talking about mutual causality between perceptions of corruption and trust in political institutions. And so essentially, the less trust people have in the system, the more likely they are to accept corruption. Then corruption is likely to reduce trust. And so it's kind of they feed into each other, essentially. And then I think there's a certain level of stickiness in corruption where, like, once a system is corrupt, it kind of like stays corrupt, essentially. If that makes any sense.
It's a self-feeding prophecy for sure.
So, question is, why does this matter? So we know why it exists. We know what causes it. Why is corruption a bad thing? So there's a couple concrete examples. So Corruption and Economic Growth by Pak Hung Mo says basically he finds, or the author finds, that we find a 1% increase in corruption reduces the growth rate of the economy by 0.72%. So there's a clear reduction in economic growth. Corruption and Growth by Paulo Mauro analyzes data showing corruption is found to lower investment, therefore lowering economic growth. So specifically lowers the level of investment. Corruption and Development, a review of issues by Barden, finds essentially, I think essentially what, the research shows 53% of this effect, this stunted growth, is due to the political instability that is caused by corruption. So when you have a more corrupt society, there's more instability, there's, higher chance that, you will lose your investment. This paper here, Corruption and the Efficiency of Capital Investment in Developing Countries by O'Toole and Tarp, basically looks at data, and it shows that bribery decreases investment efficiency. Essentially what happens is that capital is distorted and placed in the wrong areas. So essentially, that's what investment is investment is where you allocate your capital. So if you have money and you're not using it, but you want it to grow, you put it into different projects and investments. And I think what happens with corruption is oftentimes the money is either, eaten up by bribes, or it basically, let's say you use cronyism to give your friends certain contracts. You might end up sending money to projects that are actually not that efficient, that are not that good. And so corruption leads to money going into the wrong types of projects. So that's another direct reason why corruption reduces growth. And then there's this paper called The Effects of Corruption on Administrative Performance by Gould and Amaro Reyes. And this is an old paper by the World Bank from 1983. It's a working document.
That's so old.
Yeah, but basically what they show is that essentially, what corruption does is it has a devastating effect on administrative performance and economic and political development. And essentially, it incentivizes inefficiency. If you collect bribes based off of red tape, you're going to put up more red tape. So it kind of, for the most part, pushes systems towards inefficiency. There's another paper, Does Corruption Affect Income Inequality and Poverty? By Gupta, and this paper shows high and rising corruption increases income inequality and poverty by reducing economic growth, the progressivity of the tax system, the level and effectiveness of social spending, and the formation of human capital, and perpetuating an unequal distribution of asset ownership and unequal access to education. So it diverts money away from social programs, which is obviously harmful to society. And basically, things like good educational institutions, strong social services, those things help an economy grow by providing a basic services to people. And corruption often takes money out of that and into the pockets of people who shouldn't have that money. So corruption across the board is incredibly, incredibly harmful, and is probably the biggest reason why most developing economies are struggling to develop, is because of corruption. I think that is like the sort of quick answer of like, why is this country not improving? It's probably corruption. Money not going to social services, bureaucracies becoming more complicated and full of red tape, investment going into projects that are not that productive. All around, it kind of moves money into the wrong places. And that's really why corruption is so harmful.
That's a shame.
Yeah, it's unfortunate. So how do you fix corruption?
How do you fix the dismal spiral?
So this paper, it says, do transparency mechanisms reduce government corruption? A meta-analysis by Chen and Ganapati. But basically, this analysis reveals transparency has an overall significant but small effect size in reducing corruption. And, I think it says, while legal transparency mechanisms with, freedom of information laws are important, fiscal transparency and e-transparency plays a stronger role in fighting government corruption. So essentially knowing, okay, like what is, you obviously need, press reporting on things. You also need to know, like, okay, where's the money going? What documents are being written up? What is happening across the board? Just knowing what's happening reduces corruption. Another article, A Free Press is Bad News for Corruption by Brunetti and Wetter, basically tests the proposition that a free press controls corruption. And they find evidence of a significant relationship between more press freedom and less corruption in a large cross-section of countries. A lot of people complain about the media, and, oftentimes there's good reason for it. But as a general rule, the media are a very important institution to have in a society.
They are.
And I think saying like, oh, the media is evil, the media is this and that, it's like, well, what would we have without media? We would have even less insight into what's happening.
Yeah, and you're not going to read those gazillion page documents, or you're not going to like constantly watch C-SPAN. That would just, it's insane.
Yeah. And then another solution. So we already talked about the sort of, public salaries. Here's another paper, Do Higher Government Wages Induce Less Corruption? Cross-Country Panel Evidence by On and Quayon. And it looks at cross-country data over 10 years. And the units here are interesting. So it says, increasing government relative wage by 1 unit, i.e. by the amount of the average manufacturing wage in a country, is associated with a decrease in the level of perceived corruption by 0.26 units. So the units there are a little confusing, but I think the overall point is the more you pay public servants, the less corrupt a society is. Speed or Greed, High Wages and Corruption Among Public Servants by Navat, Ringwords, and Cohen. It says pecuniary incentives for public service might lead public employees to advance their own self-interests and encourage justifications for accepting bribes. So basically they're saying that, so this paper actually argues the opposite. So this article challenges the idea and says higher wages may increase public corruption. So they say increasing
interesting
financial incentives for public service might lead So that's interesting. So that is a counterpoint, worth including. I still think, I think it's pretty clear across the board. I think having strong benefits and a strong system of compensation for public servants, I think reduces corruption. I think that's like Singapore famously pays like, I think their president gets paid like $1 million a year or something. And Singapore has very low corruption. This paper, Corruption, Gender Equality, and Meritocracy. This isn't a paper. This is a chapter from a book. But basically, this basically says increasing gender equality, interestingly enough, is one way to reduce corruption. So that's another interesting perspective. Does democracy reduce corruption? So the effect of democracy on corruption, income is key by Jeter et al. And basically it says, this is very interesting. It says democratization worsens corruption in poor countries. Income plays a main role in mitigating the effect of democracy on corruption. The effect is robust after controlling for other factors. And essentially what this paper says is that for very, very poor countries, so democracy does reduce corruption, but only if your per capita GDP is above $2,000. And below that level, democratization actually can increase corruption. So there's a weird J curve.
Wild.
There's an interesting J curve where if income is low enough, democracy can actually worsen corruption. But if it's above that level, democracy strengthens or reduces corruption. Very, very interesting. I'm not sure what the mechanism is for that, but that's another interesting perspective to take. Finally, political institutions.
I wonder.
Yeah, I don't know why it is. Maybe it's
just
just
dig into that and give an update.
It could just be based off of like doling out, again, patronage networks. If you vote for me, I'll help you out type thing. And then political institutions and
like that.
Yeah, political institutions and the control of corruption across country evidence by Chong. I don't really know. Okay. I don't know what the last names are and middle names are. Let's say Xu Ping, Christine Chong, Chui Ming Ti, and Xiao Vun Cheng. And their findings show positive association between democratic institutions, government bureaucracy, and rule of law with the control of corruption. So, and then there's obviously just the civic culture. I think I couldn't find a paper on this, but my read based off of looking through things is like when you have a civic culture where the culture is basically like, hey, we're all in this together. I think that tends to reduce corruption. Whereas if you have stronger loyalties to specific factions of society, I think that makes it a lot easier to sort of justify corruption. Basically saying like, hey, this politician may be corrupt, but they're going to take care of me and, my group of people. So I think the big thing is like, how do you reduce corruption? So you need more transparency. You need more information flow. You need stronger institutions. And then you also need just a more prosperous country where people are getting paid more. And those are really the key things you need to do to reduce corruption, I think.
Yeah, I think transparency is the real key. I'm a little unconvinced on the wages, mostly because I think it's going to happen like regardless, and it's hard to keep up with private sector salaries.
Yeah, I mean,
and then also like I think it's hard to deal with increasing the salaries to disincentivize corruption unless you can let them keep that job forever, which you don't want in a situation where you want to.
Well, that's why you have pensions. That's why you have pension. Well, yeah. If you give out a pension at a somewhat younger age, I mean, there's the issue of how do you fund this, obviously. But I think when you look at countries where there's unbelievable amounts of bribery, a lot of times it's like, the police officer gets paid like a pitiful amount of money. Like, you're talking like, it's hard to compare salaries across countries, but like, let's say a police officer gets paid like $20,000 a year, has no pension on the back end. It's so much easier to like do shady things on the side. But if you get paid a stronger wage and you have a pension towards the end, and if you can lose that pension, if you get caught committing a crime, the key there is like, you know, you don't want a system where people basically get because, like, you know, the current, you know, this isn't a police reform episode, but, you know, when you have
you know what, this is a more this actually is better for a nuanced take. Like, I think there is a really big argument there for like that level of public position where you're a policeman enforcing law or whatever government public sector worker. What I'm thinking of is like paying politicians more. I'm still not sure about that, because I don't know if that's going to solve the revolving door. Because I think if someone's going to have, you know, their politician job and then serve their time for however many years and then get the promise of a high paying job on the other end, I don't think people are going to say, well, I made enough money as a congressman, so I'm going to quit working now. I think they're going to take that higher paying job.
What I'm saying is, if you pay congressmen more money, then you're more likely to attract people who already have the skill sets to find a high paying job regardless. So, for example, if they, let's say you find someone who otherwise, like, let's say they were working in an industry that was paying, I don't know, like $600,000 a year or something, and then they get offered the same amount of money to be a member of Congress. Once they leave, they already have a background in that industry they were in previously. So they're like, well, I'll go back to what I was doing before. And they already, you know, go back to what they were doing earlier. But I think if you don't have that, you can have people who are career politicians, you know, who started, you know, as a staffer at age 22, and they did politics their whole life. And then once they retire, or once they leave office, it's like, well, what do I do now? I have no other skills. In that case, it's a lot more tempting to get a position working at a lobbying firm or accepting some sort of position you're not qualified for. Whereas I think if you have people who already have that history of getting paid a lot of money, it's a lot easier to resist that temptation to become a lobbyist or to do something that is more corrupt, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
I just think, you know, as a general rule, obviously, if you pay people a ton of money, that can attract people who are motivated only by money. But I do think it also has a tendency of attracting high-performing, high-quality people. So that's my opinion. Anyways, that kind of wraps things up. Is there anything else that comes to mind?
No. But I'm going to start thinking about this AI journalism idea. I think that's going to solve all the problems.
So, all right. Well, that was the end of this series on corruption. So we'll see you next episode.